Hello everybody, welcome back. We're doing an NBA draft guide specifically in regards to what I think the Raptors should do. So sit back, relax, let's take a look. I'm in the easy trash can right now, ready to create some content that hopefully you enjoy. So let's start. NBA draft is in a couple of days. So let's take a look at the situation heading into the draft. Number one, we'll start with a quick draft overview, just looking at the general stuff regarding the NBA draft. It's a little different this year, so we'll go over that. We'll look at the state of the Raptors roster, kind of what they need, what they're looking for, and the draft strategy that they should employ. And the last little bit, we'll talk about the actual draft prospects, the guys that I think that the Toronto Raptors should take a hard look at their respective picks of 19 and 31. So, without any further ado, let's begin. Okay, let's start with some draft facts. First of all, the Toronto Raptors, as I mentioned, have the 19th and 31st overall picks. Those picks were both acquired via trade. The Raptors lost their first round pick this year, as probably all of you know, to the San Antonio Spurs. It was the 8th overall pick. That is gone now. So they're left with the 19th and 31st overall pick acquired from the Siakam and the OG Anunoby deals. Number two, the draft will be done in two parts this year. The first will be on the 26th. It will be the first round of the draft, and then the following day they will do the second round, in which the Toronto Raptors have the first overall pick in the second round. And I think that might be actually a little interesting for the Raptors. It's a little wrinkle that might make that pick more desirable for other teams, giving other teams a day to collect themselves and think about who is left on the board. Maybe gives the Raptors a little bit more leverage. Maybe they could deal that pick for something that they want. Let's talk about kind of the general consensus about this draft. And pretty much every draft expert that I've seen anyways thinks that this draft is below average. I've heard people say that it's a terrible draft. I've heard other people say that, you know, it's on the bad end of decent. It's not very good, especially at the top. There's no consensus number one guy. And there's a lot of players that could boom or bust, especially in the top half of the draft. But I think that there are solid prospects for the Raptors available at the 19th pick. And in terms of the second round, they might be able to find somebody there, although second round picks are always hit or miss, and usually on the miss end of that spectrum. So let's take a look at my general thoughts on draft strategy and sort of team building. Let's put it that way. What do I think about building a team? And drafting is definitely probably the Toronto Raptors' best quality. First of all, teams could always use more forwards and wings. And I think that that is true because those players can fit into more lineups. There's more minutes available for those types of players. Forwards can often play as bigs in small ball lineups. So there's minutes at those spots. And often wings can play as guards, especially if you have playmaking from your front court. Those are the guys that usually teams are looking to assemble a lot of. You can get a lot of them on your team without it being too redundant. Guards and bigs are on the other end of that spectrum. They are a lot of the time essential to building a complete and competitive roster, but at the same time, there are less minutes available for them because teams that run two guard lineups and double big lineups have not been successful in the past, 20 odd years. Generally, as a team building strategy, you do not want two small guards on the floor at the same time. And the same is true for two bigs. Generally, you don't want two bigs on the floor at the same time. The only exception to that rule that I've seen in the past couple of years is Minnesota. And that kind of works because Karl Anthony Towns is more of a power forward center hybrid, and his shooting ability allows him to play alongside Rudy Gobert. So there's situations where that can happen, but generally the idea is that you only want one small guard and one big on the floor at the same time. The last point is that whenever you are picking up a player, two of the biggest skills that you are looking for, two things that are almost always important that you are looking for in any draft prospect, is their ability to shoot the three-point shot and defense. Those are two things that will immediately bump your stock up. If you can do both of those things, you almost assuredly have a role in the NBA. But at any spot on the floor, it used to be that centers weren't expected to shoot threes. Now they are. Getting defense from your guard spot can often be one of something that defines a playoff series. So those two things are always things to look out for. Now let's take a look at the Toronto Raptors depth chart. And obviously, when we look at a depth chart for a team that is not in contention, you have to put a grain of salt on a lot of the people who are on this list. For example, we don't know if Gary Trent Jr. or Bruce Brown are going to be back, whether they're going to be traded or not picked up in free agency. And then there are guys like Jakob Poeltl and Kelly Olynyk who aren't maybe certain to be part of the team's long-term outlook. So penciling them in at those spots, pencil them in, don't pen them in, because they may be here now, but they might not be here in the future. And building for the future is kind of what the Toronto Raptors should be doing at this point. The Toronto Raptors have Immanuel Quickley, who I'm a big fan of, and I think he will be signed this offseason. And but behind him, they have Javon Freeman-Liberty, who I kind of like as a guy that they could develop and see what they have. But he is not somebody that I would consider to be a blue chip prospect, a guy that I am incredibly confident is going to make it. So I think that backup point guard and backup guard in general is someone that the Toronto Raptors could use. Another thing is that if you've noticed, after they dealt OG Anunoby and Pascal Siakam, while they still have Scottie Barnes, who is an all-star caliber forward, they don't really have many forwards. I don't really consider RJ Barrett to be a forward. I think he's more of a wing. Ochai Agbaji has potential, but still is a question mark. Outside of Scottie Barnes, there's not really many forwards on the roster that you would be confident to include in your rotation for the next 5 years. So that is a want for the Toronto Raptors, for sure. Last but not least, I'll just reiterate the point that the Toronto Raptors could use talent everywhere. A lot of the players on the team currently may not be here in the next couple of years. The only guys that I'm super confident will be back are Scottie Barnes, RJ Barrett, Immanuel Quickley, and to a lesser extent Grady Dick. But outside of that, they could use some talent. Let's put it that way. Okay. For the next part of the video, I think that we should take a look at some of the players that I believe the Toronto Raptors should take a look at their various draft positions. So first of all, who should they draft at number 19? And as you can see on the slide here, I've put whoever drops. So players who drop out of the lottery, that happens quite a bit. Most recently, that happened to Cam Whitmore. He was projected to go top 5, and he fell out of last year's draft all the way down from top 5 to the late teens. There's potential that a player like that may drop to you. And some of the guys that I think I would be very happy if they dropped, and I've seen their names mentioned as players who perhaps don't have a home in the lottery, or maybe teams have soured on them a little bit, whatever. I've seen their names mentioned. Cody Williams, Ron Holland, Nikola Topic, Rob Dillingham. Those guys, at pick 19 in this kind of draft, I think the Raptors would want to scoop those players up if they were to drop to them. And there's a couple of other guys too, but if you see a player drop really far from their projected mock position, I think that taking them at 19 would be a very good value proposition. I think this also applies if the Toronto Raptors, who have been rumored to perhaps want to move up in the draft, perhaps one of these players falls into the late lottery, the Raptors could look to try and package their pick, the 19th pick, with another asset, and then try and move up and draft one of those players. That would also make sense, and I'd be a fan of that as well. So let's take a look at who's next. The guy I like, and this will start the list at players who I believe will be available at pick 19, the first of whom is Bub Carrington. Now, Bub Carrington is a very intriguing prospect. He's only 18 years old. He will turn 19 in about a month, but he's a freshman out of Pittsburgh. He's 6'5", and with a 6'8" wingspan, and he plays point guard. So all of those things should pique your interest right away. A player with his measurements and size, the ability to play a guard position, that's always a good combination when it comes to roster building. Because as I mentioned, the Toronto Raptors have Immanuel Quickley on the roster, and he is a small guard, and you don't want to have multiple small guards on the floor at the same time. However, if you were to get a guard who was, say, 6'5" with a 6'8" wingspan and was decent defensively, that's a lineup that could work. So if you were to draft Bub Carrington at 19 and then put him in a backup role, he could come off of the bench in spurts, play with Immanuel Quickley, and they could share more minutes than, say, two smaller guards could. And that's not the only reason that I'm interested in Bob Carrington. I think that Bob Carrington, although his stats did not jump off the page, I think that his size, fluidity, the way that he looks on the court, his ability to create shots off of the dribble, and I think that that would be a really enticing package. He does need development. As I mentioned, he's not very efficient. Part of that is taking a lot of long twos. Part of that is the fact that he requires work on finishing. He's young. He needs to work on his body, get stronger, and he needs more reps. So he needs, the Raptors, if they were to draft Bob Carrington, would have to be willing to give him the amount of development time that he requires. And I think in their position, that is definitely doable. And perhaps that would be a reason why he would be available at pick 19, because the teams in the Toronto Raptors draft range are generally teams that made the playoffs and perhaps are not looking to add a player who requires as much development as Bob would. I think that he is a very enticing upside pick for the Toronto Raptors, and that's why I have him at number 2 here after picking up a player who drops out of the lottery. Next up, we have Zach Edey. And this is probably going to be a bit of a controversial one. And in fact, I've been sort of in and out on Zach Edey for a couple of months now, because I think we'll start with the negatives here. I think that's appropriate because there's a lot of things to unpack, and we should start with the negatives right now because they're pretty glaring. The first is that he fits this kind of archetype of a player who's very good in college, but maybe might not translate to the pros. Because those types of players are generally older, which Zach Edey is. He's 22 years old, and they physically outmatch the players who play in college, generally smaller and less athletic players. And that does fit him. He is an older player who is, enormous, and use that to his advantage, let's put it that way. 2-time National Player of the Year. Also, another thing is that he has slow foot speed. And in the NBA, that can be just kind of the kiss of death for bigs, because it limits the amount of coverages that you can play in the pick and roll. Low foot speed bigs are generally consigned to playing what's known as drop defense, where the big drops deeper into the paint and tries to cut off an avenue to the basket. And in certain pick and rolls, like against a team with a stretch 5, that can just lead to tons of open 3-point shots. And so he could be a liability at the next level because of that. Let's go kind of into what I think makes him an interesting prospect at pick 19. The first off is just, you have to look at the statistics. His stats are insane. He averaged 25 points per game on fantastic percentages, 25 points, 12 rebounds, 2 blocks, 2 turnovers in 32 minutes per game. The advanced stats said that when he was on the floor, they were a juggernaut, and when he left, they were not very good. Another thing is that, yes, he was dominant in college because of his size advantage, but guess what? He is 7'4", 300 pounds. He's not just going to have a size advantage in college, he's going to have a size advantage in the NBA as well. There are almost no players that match that physical description within the NBA. He's only 2 inches shorter than Yao Ming, who is a very similar player to him in terms of athleticism and size. But this is a new NBA where traditional bigs who only stand next to the basket, they've kind of been played off of the floor in the past. So that's something that you have to consider. He has a very soft touch around the rim. He likes to get to his spot, which is near the basket, not directly under. He doesn't have to dunk in order to finish. He has a nice hook shot. He has a good drop step. He has an array of moves that at his size make him a potent offensive threat. And the fact that he can execute those moves means that I have a high degree of certainty that he would be able to contribute on offense in the NBA. And to add to that, he has a decent to good free throw shooting percentage, which means that he has the potential to be able in the future to perhaps stretch it out and take 3-point shots a la Brook Lopez. Last but not least, I want to talk about Zach Edey's kind of mentality, his high motor, the ability to play a lot of minutes. Those are things that I think separate him from a lot of large players that have come out of college. he has wanted to get better, and he has improved almost every season. And he really does seem to have that winner's mentality. He likes to work, he likes to play, he likes contact, he likes blocking shots, he wants to win. Those are really good qualities to have in a player, not just in the locker room, but in terms of reaching your ceiling. Players with a good work ethic and a strong motor are more likely to get there. So I think that that is something to consider when you think about drafting Edey as a prospect. And lastly, pick 19, it's not like I'm suggesting drafting Zach Edey at 5th overall or 8th overall, where the Raptors were originally slated to pick. This is pick 19. I think that having a swing for the fences type move where, you know, it's a bit of a gamble, that might be the right place to pick Zach Edey. I do not think that he's going to make it into the second round. I think that this is kind of his draft range. Pick 19 is where you could see someone taking Zach Edey and hoping that he puts it together at the next level. So that's kind of my case for drafting Zach Edey. It's obviously a bit of a risky move, but that's who I have at number 3 here on my who to pick at 19. Moving on, let's talk Donon Holmes. So Donon Holmes is slated to go later than 19, but I like him as a prospect. As I mentioned when we were talking about what the Raptors need, they could use a stretch forward or big. Donon Holmes, this past season, he is a junior from Dayton, and he shot the 3-ball very well, 38% on decent volume, and he generally just has a good feel for the game, which puts him ahead of guys that are in a similar draft range to him. He's a little older, but he knows how to play the game, and he can contribute on the defensive side of the ball. They asked him to do quite a bit in Dayton because he was one of their only competent forward/bigs, and so he did. He scored 20 points per game, contributed with rebounds and blocks. But at the next level, I think you're looking at a guy who's going to be a good role player. He's 6'10", has a 7'1" wingspan, and he can play the 4 or the 5. He's a little undersized for the 5, but in the right lineup, I think he could easily play the 5. At the 4, he's not going to be an offensive juggernaut. I think a lot of his moves, they're not advanced moves, let's put it that way. He's mobile, he can catch the ball at around the free throw line and get in and finish, but he is more of a play finisher than a guy who can create. But that seems like something that the Raptors could really use. I think that a 3 and D forward/big is kind of exactly what the Raptors could use moving forward, especially alongside Scotty Barnes. Scotty Barnes is going to be getting into the paint, and you're going to want to have guys that can stretch the floor out for him, while at the same time contributing on the defensive side of the ball and rebounding. So I think it's a very compelling package. He's not a sexy pick. He's not like Bub Carrington or even Zach Edey. Seems a little safer, but at the same time, I like the package there. I think that he has a good set of skills, height, wingspan, and I think that he knows how to play the game. And those 3 things, when you combine them together and add the ability to shoot, that's an interesting prospect, and that's somebody that I think that the Raptors should consider at pick 19. Moving on, let's talk about the second round, because the Raptors do have the 31st overall pick, and just like the 19th overall pick, there are guys who I would like to see the Toronto Raptors draft if they were to drop into the second round. And I don't know how likely it is that they do, but let's talk about them anyway. Tyler Smith almost made one of my pick at 19. So I kind of wanted to talk about him at 19, but I think that there are enough flaws in his game that I would not be comfortable drafting him at pick 19. He played for the G League Ignite, which just a horrible development program there. They've wasted a lot of potential. It seems like they didn't have a coherent plan for, putting these guys in a position to succeed. So that's kind of a plus, actually, for him. He's a good athlete, 6'10", 7'1" wingspan. The problem with him is that his processing isn't quite there yet, especially on the defensive end. So he's pretty young. I believe he's 19 years old, but he does need to learn kind of the basics when it comes to defending and where to be on the defensive end. On the offensive end, this is kind of why you would be interested in him, is that he projects to be a good 3-point shooter. His shooting percentages went up and down. He took a lot of them, which is encouraging. And he can finish plays at the basket as well. So he has higher offensive upside, and if he reaches his potential, he could be a solid role player / he even has, maybe an inkling of star potential if he puts it all together. The next guy is Tyler Kolek. People have been saying that, maybe he has, a promise or a team really wanting to draft him in the early 20s. Somebody said the Suns, but who knows? I'm going to put him here anyway because I think that he would be a great guy to develop off of the bench. Lots of really positive things, especially on the offensive end. He is a small guard. He's 6'3" with a 6'3" wingspan. That's probably being a bit generous as well. He'll have to show that he has NBA level defense, NBA level quickness, the ability to get a shot off in the NBA. He'll have to prove all of that. But he is a very high level decision maker. He's great in the pick and roll. He can set guys up and he can shoot. Those would be great for the Raptors to have off of the bench, which is why I put him here. Okay, and kind of last but not least, there are a couple of other prospects in this range that I could have talked about, but let's keep the video brief. The next guy I'd be interested in drafting at 31, a guy who I think will be there at 31, is Ryan Dunn. So Ryan Dunn is a very intriguing prospect. He has a very sort of odd game. He is small forward sized, but he is a defensive juggernaut. He is really fast. He's really athletic. He blocks shots like crazy. He can stay in front of guys on the perimeter. He's switchable, good foot speed. He's good in transition. He can dunk the ball, or if the other team is in transition, get back and have a highlight reel block out of nowhere. His defensive game tape is astonishing. It's crazy. But he has the skill set. He is 6'7", with a 7'1" wingspan, so very long. But he has more of the game of a big. And by that, I'm using that pejoratively. His offensive game is not very polished, and he doesn't seem to have much touch beyond, 3 feet from the basket. He needs to add something outside of being in the dunker spot, because that's essentially what he does on offense, is that he catches lobs, he sneaks behind defenses, he runs the break. That's essentially what he does on the offensive side of the ball. He shot 20% from 3, and in terms of getting better, usually scouts look at free throw percentage to see what a player's shooting will be like and whether it will translate into a player being able to shoot threes. And that's not good either. 53% from the line is pretty abysmal mark, especially for a guy who's 6'7". That said, the second round is always a gamble. And in Ryan Dunn, you would be looking at a guy who has an elite skill, like elite. This guy, if he had any offensive game whatsoever, you're not going to draft him at 31. So you take this guy, just sit him in the training facility with the Noah board, which is the Raptors shooting gadget that they have in their training facility, and just get him to put up a gazillion shots, and maybe somehow you turn him into a 3-and-D player. And if that happened, guys have learned to shoot. It's happened before. That's kind of what you would be looking to do with him if you wanted to develop him, is get him to be able to contribute in some way outside of catch and dunks and running in transition. And if you did that, he would be a very solid pick at 31. And that about wraps it up. Those are my final thoughts. Those are the players that I'm kind of interested in. I'm obviously very interested in hearing what you guys have to say, the Toronto Raptors fans. I always love hearing your opinions on things, even if I disagree. I want to get the pulse of Raptors Nation. So if you have any kind of feedback for this video, any of the content that I covered, feel free to let me know in the comments here or on Twitter or X at Raps Report. I want to hear from you. Who are your picks? Who are the guys that you think that the Toronto Raptors should avoid? Are you excited about the prospect of moving up in the draft? Are there players there that you want to see the Toronto Raptors pick? Please let me know. And as always, thanks for tuning in to Raptors Report, your source for in-depth Raptors content.